She arrived at Iron Ridge Ranch with a cast iron skillet, a carpet bag held together by a strip of rawhide, and a dead husband's debt still clinging to her name. Nobody asked about the bruise fading yellow under her jaw. Nobody offered to take the bag. 40 cowhands looked right through her like she was smoke, just another desperate woman in a territory full of them. But Mara Whitlock had buried a man, survived a winter alone, and walked 11 miles in broken boots to earn honest wages. She wasn't looking for pity. She wasn't looking for trouble either. What she found was both, and something else entirely she never saw coming. If you've ever been the person no one noticed until they needed you, stay with me until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon that carried Mara Whitlock the last 6 miles to Iron Ridge Ranch had a broken wheel spoke and a driver who didn't speak a word the entire journey. That suited her fine. She'd used up most of her words in the months since Thomas died, on lawyers who took her money, on landlords who didn't care, on her sister back in Ohio who'd said, plainly as anything, you made your bed when you married him. So she sat in the back of that groaning wagon with her skillet on her lap and watched Wyoming roll past her in shades of burnt gold and gray. The mountains so enormous they looked like they'd been pressed into the sky by something impatient and enormous. And she thought about nothing except whether she'd get the job. She needed the job. The Iron Ridge Ranch announcement had been pinned to the board outside the Casper post office, barely legible beneath a layer of other notices. Cook wanted, Iron Ridge, wages paid monthly, references preferred. The handwriting was cramped and impatient. Mara had read it 4 times. She had no references, or rather she had one, from the hotel in Casper where she'd worked 3 weeks before the owner's wife decided Mara's face was too pretty to be trusted. What she did have was 8 years of cooking for a logging camp, which meant she could feed 50 men on short supplies, stretch salt pork into something a man would actually thank her for, and wake before dawn every single morning without complaint. She figured that was worth more than a letter. The ranch materialized out of the scrubland like something that had been there forever and resented it. The main house sat at the far end of a long dirt lane, a big 2-story structure with shuttered windows and a porch that sagged on one side. Surrounding it, a bunkhouse long as a train car, 2 massive barns, a row of supply sheds, corrals stretching in every direction. Horses moved in the far paddocks. A water tower listed slightly to the east. The whole place had the look of a thing that had been well built once, and then neglected just enough that you could see where the care had stopped. The wagon driver pulled up outside the main house without a word and nodded toward the side door. Mara climbed down, picked up her carpet bag, and knocked. The man who answered was not what she expected. He was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders with a jaw like a chunk of granite, and eyes the flat gray of a river in January. He wore his authority like a second coat, wore it so naturally you might forget to ask who'd actually given it to him. He looked at Mara the way men look at horses they're considering buying, assessing, impersonal, and a little contemptuous. "Whitlock?" he said. "Yes, sir, Mara Whitlock. I'm answering the notice for the cook position." He didn't step back to let her in, just studied her another moment. "Grant Holloway, I run this ranch." A pause that lasted a beat too long. "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 31, she said, "old enough to know my way around a kitchen." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite amusement, not quite anything she could name. He stepped aside and let her in. The kitchen was attached to the main house by a covered walkway, a long room with 3 cast iron stoves, 2 long preparation tables scarred with years of knife work, and a ceiling hung with dried herbs that hadn't been replaced since whoever last tended them had left. The smell of old grease and dust hit Mara first. Then she started noticing things. The floor was swept but not scrubbed. The stovepipes hadn't been cleaned in months. There were mouse droppings along the baseboard near the flour bin. She didn't say any of this. She set her carpet bag down and turned to Holloway. "When do the men eat?" she asked. 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 at night. 43 hands right now. Supply wagon comes Tuesdays." He crossed his arms. "Previous cook quit 3 weeks back. Men have been making do." "What happened to the previous cook?" Again that fractional pause. "Moved on," he said. "You want the position or not?" "I want to know what I'm walking into." "You're walking into a working ranch that needs a cook," Holloway said, and his voice had taken on an edge, just slight. Wages are $12 a month. You get Sundays off until roundup. You'll sleep in the room off the kitchen. You cook, you clean, you keep your mouth out of ranch business. His eyes moved over her in a way she'd been on the receiving end of before. She'd learned not to flinch at it. That clear? Clear as anything, Mara said. She started the next morning. The first week was an education in chaos. The supply shed was a disaster. Inventory scattered, items mislabeled or missing entirely, sacks of flour stacked against a wall that had a moisture problem. She could tell just by looking at the base of the boards. She reorganized it in a single day, working through the lunch hour, and when she served dinner that first evening, it was venison stew with cornbread. Nothing complicated, but it was hot, and it was real, and she watched 40-some faces go through a visible shift when they tasted it. Men were simple in that way, she'd found. Feed them well, and they'd forgive you almost anything else. Almost. She learned the rhythms of the bunkhouse fast. There were the loud ones who sat in the middle of the long tables, trading insults and stories in equal measure. There were the quiet card players in the corner. There were the young ones, barely past 20, who still had that hopeful look that Wyoming hadn't finished wearing off them yet. There were 3 Mexican vaqueros who spoke limited English, but always left their tin plates cleaner than anyone else. And then there was the man who came last. Every evening after the other hands had filed through and filled their plates and taken their seats, or wandered back to the bunkhouse, after the noise had settled to a low murmur and the kitchen lamps threw long shadows, he would come. Not hurrying, not sneaking, just arriving quietly, the way a man does when he's long since stopped expecting anyone to hold a place for him. He was old, or he looked old. Maybe 55, maybe more. Hard to tell with men who worked outdoors. The sun and wind did their own kind of aging. His face was deeply lined, his hands enormous and calloused, his hair gone gray at the temples and thinning on top. He wore the same clothes as the other hands, but carried himself differently. Not proudly, exactly. More like a man who had decided a long time ago that dignity wasn't something other people got to assign to you. He never pushed through the line, never grabbed for the last biscuit. He'd take what was left, whatever she hadn't cleared yet, and he'd sit at the far end of the last table, alone, and eat without looking at anyone. The first time Mara saw him, she thought he was a new arrival who'd come in late and missed the meal. She'd been about to start scraping the big pot when he appeared in the doorway. "There's stew left," she told him, "and some cornbread if you want it." He looked at her like she'd said something unusual. "Thank you," he said. His voice was quiet, measured, the voice of a man who chose his words with some care before he spent them. He took a modest portion and went to the far end of the table. The second evening, she noticed him again. Third evening, too. By the fourth, it was an accident. She was watching for him. And she noticed something. He always waited until the others were done. Not because he was slow or late from work. He was there before them sometimes. She'd catch him through the window crossing the yard. But he'd stand somewhere out of the way and wait until the crowd had thinned. On the fifth evening, she kept the stew warm on the back burner. Set aside 2 biscuits under a cloth. Had a slice of the dried apple cake she'd made from a crate of preserves she'd found in the back of the supply shed. When he came through the door, she had a plate ready. He stopped. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. Something passed across his face that she couldn't entirely read. Surprise and something older than surprise. Something that had been dormant a long time. "Sit down," she said. "It's warm." He sat. He ate. He didn't say much of anything. When he was done, he brought the plate to the wash basin, which none of the other hands did, and he said, "Name's Thorne. Thorne Callow." "Mara Whitlock," she said. He nodded once, like he was filing that away, and walked back out into the dark. His name, as best she could piece together from the few scraps of conversation the other hands were willing to offer, meant next to nothing to the rest of them. "Old Thorne?" said a young hand named Eddie Pierce, barely 19, when Mara asked. He was helping her carry flour sacks one Tuesday when the supply wagon came in. "Been here forever. Does whatever needs doing. You need a fence mended or a roof patched or some drainage dug, Holloway throws it at Thorne." He shrugged. "Doesn't talk much." "Where's he from?" "Don't know. Nobody does, really." Eddie set down the flour sack and scratched the back of his neck. "He don't bother nobody. Nobody bothers him. That's about the size of it." She asked Holloway once, casually, just trying to understand the lay of the ranch. Holloway was going over a list at the big table in the main house, and he barely looked up. "Callow's a laborer," he said. "Been here longer than most. Does the work nobody else wants. Why?" "Just getting to know who's here." "You don't need to know who's here," Holloway said. "You need to know what they eat." She let it go, but she kept noticing. Thorne Callow did the work nobody else wanted. When the drainage ditch near the south barn backed up after a week of rain, it was Thorne out in the mud until dark fixing it. When a section of the fence line along the north pasture rotted out and 3 horses got into the grain store, it was Thorne who found them, wrangled them back, repaired the fence in a single afternoon, and never mentioned it to anyone. He mucked stalls that the younger hands avoided. He repaired a broken axle on the supply wagon using nothing but hand tools and a piece of scrap iron. He didn't ask for extra pay. He didn't complain. The other hands weren't cruel to him. They were worse. They were indifferent. He was furniture to them, part of the landscape. Mara had known that feeling. She knew it very well. November arrived hard, the way Wyoming Novembers do, with a week of gray skies followed by a 3-day blizzard that kept everyone inside and made the cookhouse the most popular building on the ranch. Mara fed men in shifts, kept the stoves burning, and learned the interior geography of the bunkhouse by smell, wood smoke and leather, and unwashed wool, and the particular sour note of men kept too long indoors. She'd been at Iron Ridge 6 weeks when Grant Holloway started becoming a problem. It was small things at first. The way he'd lean against the kitchen door frame when she was working, watching her for longer than was comfortable. The way he'd find reasons to come to the kitchen, checking on the supply count, reviewing the weekly meal plan, bringing small issues that didn't need his attention at all. He wasn't aggressive about it. Men like Holloway rarely were, at first. They were patient in the way cats were patient outside mouse holes. One evening, he came in while she was baking and stood close behind her at the preparation table, looking over her shoulder at a recipe she'd written out. "Smells good in here," he said. He didn't move back. "Dried apple and cinnamon," she said, and took a step to the side, natural as breathing. "The men seem to appreciate something sweet on Fridays. Keeps morale up." "I'd say you keep morale up," Holloway said. She turned and looked at him directly. "I appreciate that, Mr. Holloway. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to pull those from the oven." He smiled, the careful, constructed smile of a man who is recalibrating. "Of course," he said, but he stayed in the doorway another minute before he left. She started making sure she was never in the kitchen alone when he was likely to be around. Started keeping the door propped open. Small adjustments, invisible armor. She'd worn it before. The friendship with Thorne, if you could call it that, being as it was conducted almost entirely in the language of small gestures, developed so quietly she almost didn't notice it happening. He started bringing things. A wedge of sharp cheese from the supply shed she hadn't seen. A bucket of clean water from the well when the cistern was acting up. One morning she came in to find that someone had replaced the broken latch on the kitchen door. She'd been using a wedge of wood to keep it shut for 2 weeks. The new latch was iron, solid, recently made, with small, careful marks on the metal that were recognizably Thorne's work. She asked him about it that evening. "It was a hazard," he said simply, as if this explained everything. "I appreciate it," she said. "I've been meaning to report it to Mr. Holloway, but—" "He wouldn't have gotten to it," Thorne said. He wasn't being critical, just stating a fact the way you'd state that rain was wet. She sat across from him at the far table. She'd started joining him some evenings, when the kitchen was cleaned up and the other hands were gone. She'd bring the last of the coffee, and they'd sit. They didn't always talk much. Some evenings they barely spoke at all. But it was comfortable in a way that surprised her, being as she'd forgotten what comfortable felt like around another person. He asked her one night where she'd come from. Not prying, just asking. She told him about the logging camp 8 years near Laramie. About Thomas, briefly. She'd married him when she was 22. He was a decent man with a bad instinct for debt and worse luck. And when the logging company folded, he'd borrowed money from people you shouldn't borrow from, and it had ended the way those stories ended. She didn't say at all of that exactly. She said enough, and he listened in a way that told her he understood the shape of things she wasn't saying. "And you?" she asked. "Where are you from?" He was quiet a moment, looking at his coffee cup. "North," he said finally. "A long time ago." She didn't push. She recognized a closed door when she saw one. What she did notice, over those weeks, was that he paid attention. Not in the way Holloway did, not possessive or calculating. Thorne paid attention the way a careful man pays attention to something he values and doesn't want to lose. He'd notice when she was tired without her having to say it. He'd know somehow when a supply delivery hadn't arrived and she was stretching what she had to feed 40 men without complaint. He'd appear with something useful, not always, not every time, just enough that she learned to stop being surprised. One evening in late November, she burned her arm on the stove door. A bad burn, a stripe of red across her forearm. She hissed through her teeth and wrapped a cloth around it and went back to work. An hour later, Thorne came in and set a small jar on the table beside her. "Comfrey salve," he said, "for burns." She looked at the jar, looked at him. "Where'd you get this?" "Made it," he said. And that was all. She used it. The burn healed faster than any burn she'd had before. It was a horsebreaker named Riverhawk who first mentioned the discrepancies. He appeared at the kitchen door one December afternoon. A lean, watchful man in his late 30s, part Shoshone by the look of him, with quiet dark eyes that missed nothing. He worked the breaking paddock on the far east side of the ranch, which was far enough from the main operation that he existed somewhat outside the usual bunkhouse politics. Mara had only spoken to him a handful of times, usually when he came in late from working a difficult horse and needed something left warm. "Miss Whitlock," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "You do the supply inventory here?" "I keep track of the kitchen stores," she said. "Why?" He looked over his shoulder, a quick automatic check, then stepped inside. "I'm not sure who to say this to," he said, which was not what she expected. "And maybe I'm wrong, but there's things going missing from the main supply shed that don't make sense." She turned to face him fully. "What kind of things?" "Rope, tools, feed grain." He paused. "And some of the salt pork from the big stores, more than what gets used. I keep a rough count in my head. I know how much we start each month with, and I know what the horses go through, and the numbers don't match." "Have you told Mr. Holloway?" Riverhawk's expression said everything his words didn't. He put his hat back on. "I thought you should know," he said, "since you're the one who'd catch the blame if kitchen stores came up short." He left. Mara stood in the middle of the kitchen and let that settle. That evening, she mentioned it to Thorne, quietly, just the two of them at the far table, the lamp turned low. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man hearing confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "You should keep records," he said. "Everything that comes in and everything that goes out, dated, detailed." "I already keep a rough accounting." "Exact," he said. "Write down the weight of every sack, every barrel, count the jars, date the deliveries down to the hour if you can." He looked at her directly. "If someone's building a case against you, you need to have built yours first." It was the most words she'd heard him say at one time. She looked at him, really looked at him, not just the surface of him, and saw something she hadn't quite registered before. The way he talked about the ranch wasn't the way a hired laborer talked. There was a different quality to it. Ownership wasn't the right word exactly. More like grief. But she didn't know what to do with that observation yet, so she set it aside. She started keeping the records. December thickened. Snow came in earnest, real Wyoming snow, the kind that made the world go quiet and mean. The cowhands, who'd been amiable enough through the fall, started getting on each other's nerves in the way men did when they were cold and crowded. There were 2 fistfights in the bunkhouse in the span of a week, over nothing worth fighting about. Holloway had started looking at her differently. She could feel it, a shift in the quality of his attention, from the patient, predatory kind to something harder, as if he'd been expecting her to recognize the obvious power he held, and she'd failed to do so, and he was now reassessing his strategy. At the December supply delivery, 3 sacks of flour she'd ordered weren't on the wagon. She questioned the driver, who told her Holloway had redirected items to a secondary order. When she asked Holloway about it, he told her she'd have to make do, and the way he said it had a specific kind of satisfaction in it. She made do. But she wrote it down. Every single detail, in the small leather-bound notebook she now kept tucked inside her apron pocket at all times. One evening, she came back from the supply shed in the early dark and nearly walked into Eddie Pierce and two of the older hands standing outside the kitchen door, talking in lowered voices. They went quiet when they saw her. "Evening," she said. "Evening, Miss Whitlock," Eddie said. He had the look of a man who'd been caught at something but wasn't sure exactly what. She went inside. Through the cracked door, she heard one of the older hands say, "Heard 2 sacks went missing last week." And then lower, "Somebody's got to be—" And then she couldn't hear anymore. She thought about it all night. The next morning, she was making biscuits before dawn. She liked the kitchen best at that hour. The silence of it, the particular dark before first light that felt like the day still belonged to her. When Thorne came to the kitchen door, she'd never seen him there that early. She looked up from the board where she was cutting biscuits, and he was standing in the doorway looking like a man who'd been awake for a while. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in, poured himself a cup, and sat at the near table instead of the far end. His big hands wrapped around the cup. "There's talk," he said. "I heard some of it," she said, and kept cutting biscuits. "It'll get louder." "I know." "Your records," he said. "Keep them somewhere safe, not just the notebook. Write a second copy and hide it somewhere separate." She set down the biscuit cutter and looked at him. "Thorne, what do you know?" He met her eyes. In the early lamplight, with the cold dark pressing against the windows, she could see something in his face she hadn't seen before. Or rather, something she'd seen but hadn't let herself understand. It wasn't just concern. It wasn't just the wary attention of a man looking out for a friend. It was a man who had skin in this game in a way that she still didn't fully understand. "I know this ranch," he said, "and I know what happens to people Holloway decides are inconvenient. What happened to the cook before me?" A pause. "She left," he said, with enough doubt attached to her name that she couldn't find work at another ranch in the territory. Mara looked at the biscuit cutter in her hand, looked at the window where the first gray light was starting to show at the edges of the mountains. "Then I'd better make sure I'm not easy to doubt," she said. She put the first tray of biscuits in the oven. Thorne drank his coffee. Outside, the ranch was starting to wake. She could hear the barn doors, the distant sound of horses, the particular creak of the bunkhouse door that meant the hands were coming. She had 43 men to feed. She had a notebook full of records. She was beginning to understand, an ally she didn't fully know yet. A man who came last and took the hardest jobs and asked for nothing, and who was turning out to be the most complicated person on this entire ranch. She didn't know yet how complicated. She didn't know yet who he really was, or what Iron Ridge Ranch really was, or what it was going to take to save it. She just knew that she wasn't leaving. She had survived worse. She had buried her dead and walked 11 miles in broken boots and rebuilt herself out of whatever was left. She was not going to be made into a thief by a man with flat gray eyes and a careful smile. The biscuits rose. The coffee stayed hot. The light came up slow and cold over the mountains, and Mara Whitlock stood at her stove and kept her feet under her and waited to see what came next. The second copy of the record she hid in the lining of her carpet bag, stitched in with a needle and thread she borrowed from Eddie Pierce without explanation. The first copy stayed in the notebook in her apron. It wasn't much of a defense, she knew that. Paper didn't stop a determined man, but it was the only weapon she had that didn't require her to raise her voice or her hand. And she'd learned long ago that the quietest weapons were sometimes the ones that lasted. January came down on Iron Ridge like something with a grudge. The temperature dropped so fast the water in the cistern developed a skin of ice by midnight, and Mara was up before 4 every morning feeding the stoves, just to keep the kitchen from freezing solid. She developed a routine the way you develop calluses, through repetition and necessity until it stopped hurting. Up in the dark, stoves lit, water heated, bread started. By the time the first gray seam appeared over the mountains, she had biscuits in the oven and porridge on the back burner and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The men were harder in January. The cold made everyone shorter, meaner, quicker to take offense. 3 of the younger hands got into it at dinner one night over a card game debt that had been simmering since December, and it ended with a split lip and an overturned bench and Mara standing in the middle of it, holding a cast iron spoon like she was considering using it on whoever moved next. They settled down. Men usually did when you stopped being afraid of them. Holloway watched her that night from the doorway. She felt his eyes on her back when she turned to the stove, and when she turned around again, he was gone. The supply situation got worse. It happened gradually, the way a slow leak is worse than a fast one because you don't notice until the floor is wet and the damage is done. She'd order 40 pounds of cornmeal and receive 32. A case of canned tomatoes would arrive with 4 tins missing. The monthly allotment of salt pork, which she'd calculated to the pound based on how many men she was feeding and how many meals per week, kept coming up short by enough to notice, but not by enough to prove exactly, without her records. With her records, it was very provable indeed. She wrote it all down. Delivery date, expected quantity, actual quantity received, initials of whoever brought the wagon in. She made herself be precise about it even when she was tired enough to make mistakes, even when her handwriting went sideways and she had to go back and correct it. Thorne had told her to be exact, and she trusted that instruction even when she didn't yet fully understand the reason behind it. The whispers in the bunkhouse got louder. She heard fragments, never the whole sentence, just pieces. Supplies running short. Cook's supposed to manage inventory. Wonder if she's... And then voices dropping when she came close. She made herself walk calmly, speak normally, serve meals without her hands shaking even when they wanted to. She'd been watched before. She'd been doubted before. The trick was not to let them see it land, but it was landing. Some days it landed hard. One afternoon in mid-January, she was alone in the supply shed doing her weekly count when she heard the door and turned around to find 2 of the older hands, men named Calder and Briggs, both of whom had been at Iron Ridge longer than she had and wore that fact like a badge, standing in the entrance blocking most of the light. "Need something?" she said. Calder looked around the shed with the slow, deliberate attention of a man making a point. "Just checking on things," he said. "Holloway asked us to do a count." "I'm doing a count right now," Mara said. "You're welcome to stand here and watch if that's useful." Neither of them moved. Briggs, a heavy-set man with a reddish beard, crossed his arms. "There's been talk," he said, "about missing supplies." "There has," she agreed. "I've noticed it too. I've been keeping records." "Records?" Calder said the word like it tasted questionable. "If you'd like to see them, I'm happy to show you," Mara said, holding his gaze. "Every delivery since I arrived. Weights, dates, quantities, all of it." She paused. "Though I wonder if Holloway's asked you to do a count of the main supply shed too, or just the kitchen." Something shifted in Calder's face. Not guilt, exactly. More like an adjustment, a man recalculating. He and Briggs exchanged a look she wasn't supposed to catch. "We'll be checking that too," Briggs said, a half-second too late. They left. She stood in the supply shed with her clipboard and her pencil and counted everything twice, then went back to the kitchen and sat down at the near table and let herself feel scared for exactly 5 minutes. Then she stood up and started dinner. Check. It was Riverhawk who brought her the next piece of the picture. And this time he didn't look like a man who was unsure whether to speak. He looked like a man who'd made up his mind. He appeared at the kitchen door on a Sunday afternoon, her day off, which she spent mostly in the kitchen anyway because the kitchen was the only space on the ranch that felt like it belonged to her. She'd been mending the hem of her work dress when he knocked. "Come in," she said. He came in, stood near the door, turned his hat in his hands. "I followed the supply wagon," he said without preamble. She set down her mending. "When?" "Last Tuesday. The delivery came in at 2, same as usual, and I watched them unload. But about an hour after, Calder took the wagon back out, said he was returning it to town. He went north on the Casper Road." Riverhawk paused. "There's no reason to take the Casper Road to return a wagon to the livery. The livery's south." Mara looked at him. "Where does the north road go?" "About 11 miles up. There's an old relay station. Been abandoned 3 years." Another pause, longer. "I didn't follow all the way, but I watched long enough to see the wagon didn't come back empty." She thought about that. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw? I want to write it down." He told her. She wrote it down in the notebook in her careful handwriting, with the date and his name and every detail he gave her. When he was done, he looked at the notebook and then at her. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "whatever's happening here, it's been happening a long time, long before you came." "I know," she said. "Then whoever set it up..." He stopped, chose his words. "They're not going to stop just because someone's taking notes." "No," she agreed. "But notes are how you prove something happened after it's over." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "There's something else, something I've been trying to understand. He looked out the kitchen window toward the ranch yard. You know how Callow's assigned work? Every month, Holloway gives out assignments. Best jobs go to the senior hands. Hardest jobs go to whoever's available. But Callow, every month, without fail, he gets the jobs that take him to the far edges of the ranch. Boundary work, drainage, fence line repair on the north sections. He turned back to her. I didn't think much of it for a long time, but lately I've been thinking, those are also the jobs that keep him away from the main supply operations, away from the yard on delivery days. Mara sat very still. That's deliberate, she said. That's what I think, Riverhawk said. He put his hat back on. Just thought you should know. She didn't confront Thorne directly. Not right away. She needed to think, and thinking was something she did best while her hands were busy. So she thought while she cooked and cleaned and organized and kept her face neutral in front of 43 men who were increasingly divided into those who were watching her with suspicion and those who were watching her with something closer to guilt. Eddie Pierce was in the second camp. He was 19 and not yet good at hiding what he felt, and what he felt was uncomfortable. He started helping her carry things without being asked. Flour sacks, water buckets, wood for the stoves, and when she thanked him, he'd look at the ground. Finally, one evening when they were alone in the kitchen and she'd run out of patience for the slow dance of it, she said, Eddie, just tell me. He looked up from the firewood he was stacking. Tell you what, whatever it is you're not saying. He was quiet a moment, then. Calder's been telling people you're skimming, that you're the one taking supplies and selling them in town on your days off. He said it fast, like he'd been holding it and needed to get it out. I don't believe it. I thought you should know what's being said. Thank you, she said. She meant it. I don't know why Holloway would... Eddie stopped. It's okay, she said. You don't have to finish that. He went back to stacking wood. She went back to the stove. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the wind off the mountains pressing against the walls. Miss Whitlock, Eddie said after a while, is everything going to be okay? She thought about that honestly before she answered. I don't know, she said, but I'm not going anywhere. But she picked her moment with Thorne carefully. 2 evenings after her conversation with Riverhawk, on a Thursday when the bunkhouse was loud with a card game and the cold had driven everyone inside, she waited until the kitchen was empty and then went and found him. He was in the small storage room off the south barn, repairing a harness by lamplight. He looked up when she came in. Whatever he saw on her face made him set down the harness. She sat on a crate across from him. I want to tell you what I know, she said, and then I want you to tell me what you know. He waited. She laid it out in order, Riverhawk following the wagon, the relay station, the deliberate assignment of boundary work, the pattern of missing supplies going back months. She watched his face while she talked. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man watching a storm he'd seen coming finally arrive. When she was done, he was quiet a long time. I know about the relay station, he said. How long? I suspected before you arrived. I've been trying to confirm it. He looked at his hands. The problem is confirmation isn't the same as evidence anyone will act on. What do you mean? Holloway has Calder and Briggs and at least 2 others who will back whatever account he gives. The supply company driver takes his instruction from whoever signs the ranch's accounts. If he reports missing supplies, the first person he reports to is Holloway. He paused. The territory marshal's office is in Casper. It takes something significant to bring a marshal out here. Then we need something significant, she said. He looked at her directly. You've kept records. Everything since October. Every delivery, every shortage, every discrepancy. Riverhawk's account of the wagon going north. The dates. She paused. But you said something back in December. You said your records. Not the records or some records. You said yours like you had a particular stake in it. She let that sit between them. Who are you, Thorne? The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind was making a sound along the barn eaves, a low, steady moan that had been going all day. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something shift in him, not breaking exactly. More like a door that had been stuck for a long time, finally moving on its hinges. My full name is Thorne Callow, he said. I've been on this ranch for 22 years. I was born about 40 miles north of here, and my father built a small cattle operation, and when he died, I inherited it. He stopped, started again. Iron Ridge isn't just where I work, Mara. It's mine. The deed is in my name. Has been since 1864. She said nothing. Let him go on. My wife died in the spring of 1878. Fever. We'd been married 11 years, and she was the better part of what made this place worth running. He said it flatly, without performance. After she died, I wasn't fit to run much of anything. I hired Holloway to manage operations. He came with good references, and for the first year he ran things well enough that I stopped paying close attention. A pause. That was my mistake. He moved into the position, Mara said. He filled every space I left empty. By the time I came back to myself enough to notice, he'd built a structure around him. Loyalties, small debts, habits, men who'd take his word over mine. He looked at his hands again. And I made it worse. I started, staying out of the way, working alongside the hands instead of above them. It was easier than reasserting authority I'd let go slack. He stopped. Easier than coming back to the house. She understood that, the part about the house especially. The main house, she said. The shutters. I haven't lived in it since she died. The wind pressed against the barn. The lamp gave a small shudder. Holloway knows who you are, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Then the reason he keeps you on the boundary work is to keep me at the edges, Thorne said, out of the supply yard, away from the records, close enough to manage if I cause trouble, far enough away to ignore if I don't. He looked at her steadily. When you started keeping records, I knew someone was finally paying attention. And when Holloway started building a case against you, I understood what was happening. He wanted to discredit the only person who might actually document what he's doing, Mara said. Yes. She sat with that a moment. You could have told the hands, shown your deed, asserted your ownership. I could have, he said. Holloway would have called it the rambling of an old man who'd gone soft in the head after his wife died. He has 2 years of authority behind him. I have... He gestured at himself, at the worn clothes and the calloused hands and the lamplight making him look every year of his age. This. She understood that too. How a person could let themselves become unrecognizable. How grief could strip you down to something that didn't match what you used to be, until the distance between who you were and who you seemed was too wide to explain. Not without evidence, she said. Not without evidence, he agreed. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the notebook and set it on the crate between them. He looked at it. This is a start, she said, but we need more. Riverhawk's testimony about the wagon, the dates, the discrepancies, whoever else has noticed what's missing. She paused. And we need someone to go to that relay station and see what's actually there. That someone can't be you, he said immediately. I know. It can't be you either. Holloway knows your face and Calder watches your movements. Riverhawk, Thorne said. Riverhawk, she agreed. They sat across from each other in the lamplight, with the harness on the floor between them and the notebook on the crate, and the wind saying its long, cold thing outside. And Mara thought, this is what it looks like when two people decide to trust each other. Not a grand moment, not any kind of ceremony, just a decision made in a cold barn, because the alternative was worse. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to tell me the truth. All right. How bad is it? The corruption? How far does it go? He thought about it. Not the thinking of a man deciding what to tell her, but of a man putting something together he'd been assembling for a while. The supply skimming is the part I can prove, he said. But I think the land records are involved too. There's a mortgage Holloway arranged in the ranch's name while I wasn't paying attention. I don't know the full scope of it. I haven't been able to access the ranch's financial documents. Holloway keeps them in the main house. In your house, she said quietly. He said nothing. Then we need those too, she said. At some point. At some point, he said, when we have enough of everything else. She stood up, tucked the notebook back in her apron, and straightened her coat. He stood too. And for a moment they were just two people standing in a barn with a lot of work ahead of them, and the cold pressing in from all sides. Thorne, she said, whatever happens, you should know this is your ranch. You should be living in that house. He looked at her. For a moment his face was very still and very readable, which was unusual for him. She saw things in it she recognized, loss that had calcified into something functional, the particular loneliness of a person who'd stopped expecting to be known by anyone. I know, he said quietly. I'm not ready yet. She nodded. That was honest, at least. She respected honest more than ready. Well, she said, when you are. She moved toward the door. I'll have coffee on early tomorrow. Come before the others. She went back across the cold yard to the kitchen and started thinking about what came next. What came next arrived faster than either of them expected. The last week of January brought a messenger from Casper, a young man who came in on a roan horse and went directly to Holloway without stopping anywhere else. Mara watched from the kitchen window. The conversation lasted 15 minutes. The messenger left. Holloway stood in the ranch yard for a long time after, looking at nothing, and then turned and walked toward the main house with a particular kind of deliberateness that she'd learned to read as trouble. That evening, Calder came to the kitchen during dinner and announced, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, that Holloway would be conducting a full supply audit in the morning, starting with the kitchen stores. The room went quieter than it should have. Mara spooned stew without her expression changing. That's fine, she said. I have records ready. Calder looked like he'd expected a different reaction. He left. Across the room, at the far end of the last table, Thorne was looking at her over his coffee cup. She met his eyes once, briefly. He gave the smallest nod she'd ever seen a person give and went back to his meal. Riverhawk came to the kitchen door after the men had cleared out. He didn't come inside, just stood in the doorway with his coat collar up against the cold. The station, he said. I went out this morning, early, before work. She waited. It's not abandoned, he said. There are 2 men there, and there's a lot of ranch supply, rope, tools, grain sacks, stacked in the back room. Enough to fill half a wagon. He paused. And something else. A strong box. Padlocked. I didn't touch it, but it was new, recent. She looked at him steadily. Would you be willing to write down what you saw? He was quiet a moment. If it matters, he said. Yes. It matters, she said. He came inside and she gave him paper and a pencil, and he sat at the near table and wrote in a slow, careful hand while she cleaned up around him. When he was done, he slid the paper to her, and she read it and folded it inside the notebook. She was adding it to the second copy when she heard footsteps on the walkway, heavy, purposeful, and the kitchen door opened without a knock. Holloway filled the doorway. He looked at the notebook on the table. He looked at her. Working late, he said. Always, she said. She folded the notebook closed but didn't hide it. He stepped inside, let the door fall shut behind him. The kitchen was warm and bright and very small all of a sudden. He looked at the notebook on the table between them and then up at her face. You've been busy, he said. His voice was pleasant. That was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. I run a busy kitchen, she said. He picked up a mug she'd left on the table, not asking, just picking it up, and turned it in his hands the way a man handles someone else's thing to show he can. The audit tomorrow, he said. I want it to go smoothly. Then I'd suggest we both come with accurate records, she said. The pleasantness slipped, just for a second. She saw what was underneath it, and it wasn't temper which she'd expected. It was something colder and more considered. A man who had thought this through and decided he was going to win. You know, he said, setting the mug down, it's a shame. You're capable, efficient, under other circumstances. Good night, Mr. Holloway, she said. His eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded once, that careful nod, and walked out. She waited until his footsteps faded across the yard. Then she took the notebook, walked to her room off the kitchen, lifted a loose floorboard she'd found her 3rd week there, and put the notebook underneath it. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the cold and thought about the audit in the morning and what Holloway would do when the numbers didn't say what he needed them to say and what he'd do after that. Outside, the wind had died. The ranch was very quiet. Somewhere across the yard, in the bunkhouse, 40-some men slept without knowing that the ground under Iron Ridge was shifting. She didn't sleep much, but she'd learned to manage on not much sleep. It was one of the things the last few years had been good for, if good was the word. She kept her feet under her. That was all you could do sometimes. Keep your feet under you and be ready for morning. The audit started at 7 in the morning, which meant Mara was up at 4 to make sure everything was exactly where her record said it should be. She didn't sleep the remaining hours between Holloway's visit and the alarm of her own internal clock. She lay in the narrow bed and ran numbers in her head instead, weights and dates and quantities, the particular arithmetic of a woman building a case out of what most people would call housekeeping. When the darkness outside her window began separating into the individual shapes of the yard and the barn and the water tower listing east, she got up and lit the lamp and put on her work clothes. She had the stoves going and the coffee on when Thorne appeared at the kitchen door, earlier than usual, even for him. He came in without knocking and stood at the near table and looked at her, and she could see he hadn't slept much either. "How are you?" he said. "Ready?" she said. "You?" "The same." He poured himself coffee and stood holding it. Riverhawk's written statement, "Is it somewhere safe?" under the floorboard with the notebook. "I have the copy in the lining of my bag." She turned back to the stove. "He's going to find something, Thorne. Whether it's real or not, he's going to find something that points at me. He came here last night and looked at this kitchen like a man measuring a room for a coffin." "Let him find what he finds," Thorne said. "Your records predate any accusation he makes. Every shortage is documented against deliveries he controlled." A pause. "The question is whether anyone in that room will be willing to look at the evidence and think." "Eddie will," she said. "Maybe 2 others. The rest will follow whichever way the wind blows." "That's enough," he said. "For now." She wasn't sure she believed that, but she held on to it. Holloway arrived at 8 with Calder and Briggs and a ledger under his arm that he set on the preparation table like he was laying down a hand of cards. He looked rested. That bothered her more than anything else about him. The man had slept fine while she hadn't. "We'll start with what's on hand," he said, "and compare against your records." "Of course," she said. "My records go back to October 15th. Something moved across Calder's face. He'd expected her to be defensive, she could tell. Expected the nerves to show. She kept her voice flat and her hands still. They went through this kitchen stores methodically. Sacks of flour, cornmeal, oats. The salt pork barrel, the lard, the preserved goods. The spice jars she'd reorganized and labeled in her first week. Holloway called out quantities and Briggs wrote them down, and Mara stood to the side with her notebook open, checking each number against her own columns. The kitchen stores matched her records almost exactly. She was 11 pounds short on cornmeal. She said so before Holloway could. Pointed to the entry that showed the delivery on January 9th had come in 11 pounds light, initialed by Calder himself, who'd brought the wagon in. Calder looked at his initials, said nothing. Holloway moved on without commenting on it, which was its own kind of answer. The discrepancy he did find was in the main supply shed, where 120 pounds of grain and 2 coils of rope and assorted tools were recorded in the ranch ledger as present but were physically absent. He turned to Mara with the ledger open in his hands. "These items," he said, "they're listed as transferred to the kitchen stores last November." "They were never transferred to my kitchen," she said. "That transfer doesn't appear in my records." "Your records aren't the official record," Holloway said pleasantly. "No," she said, "but they're accurate, and they're dated." She held his gaze. "If it's in the ranch ledger as transferred to my care, I'd like to know who signed off on the transfer and when, and whether there's a corresponding entry in the kitchen inventory." Holloway looked at the ledger. The entry, she could see from where she stood, had handwriting that wasn't entirely consistent with the entries above and below it. Newer ink, maybe. She filed that observation and kept her face still. "We'll need time to review the full ledger," Holloway said. "Take all the time you need," she said. "I'd be glad to have everything reviewed." The audit ended without a conclusion, which was a kind of victory that felt nothing like one. Holloway gathered his papers and his men and left the kitchen, and the door closed and Mara sat down hard on the nearest stool and let out a breath she'd been holding since 7 o'clock. Eddie Pierce, who'd been standing near the door for the last 20 minutes pretending he had a reason to be there, looked at her. "That entry in the ledger," he said quietly. "The handwriting." "I noticed," she said. "Briggs writes like that," he said. "I've seen his hand on the work assignments." She looked at him. He was 19 and uncomfortable in doing the right thing in the uncertain way of someone who wasn't entirely sure what the right thing was going to cost him. "Thank you, Eddie," she said. He left quickly, like he was worried about being seen having said it. Dashkit. The days that followed had a particular quality she recognized from the worst stretch after Thomas died. That compressed, airless feeling of waiting for the next blow without knowing from which direction it was coming. Holloway didn't move against her immediately. He let the uncertainty work on her, which was the smarter play. A man who understood pressure knew that sometimes the most effective application of it was simply making someone wait. She kept cooking, kept her records, kept her head down in the way that was strategic rather than defeated. Thorne, meanwhile, was doing something she didn't fully understand at first. He started appearing in different parts of the ranch than he usually did. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch Holloway's attention, but consistently enough that she noticed. He was in the supply yard on delivery days, doing some repair work near enough to watch the unloading. He was in the barn when Calder and Briggs were there, mending a harness or fixing a water trough, quiet as furniture and twice as overlooked. He was gathering information the same way she was, with patience and with the particular power of being dismissed by everyone around him. He came to her one morning in early February with a piece of paper, a sketch, actually, done in pencil, showing what she recognized after a moment as the layout of the relay station. Distances, measurements, locations of stored items. "You went out there," she said. "2 days ago, before first light." He sat down and put the sketch on the table. "The strongbox Riverhawk saw is still there, and there's a second one now. They brought something out on Monday's wagon run. I watched the wagon leave the yard, and when I looked at the load against the delivery list, we were short 40 pounds of salt pork and a case of canned goods that should have gone to your stores." She looked at the sketch. "This is enough to take to the marshal." "It would be," he said, "if we could get the marshal here without Holloway knowing we'd sent for him." He paused. "Holloway has a man at the telegraph office in Casper, a cousin, I think. If we send a wire, he'll know before the marshal reads it." "Then we need someone to ride to Casper." "Riverhawk offered," Thorne said. "He has reasons of his own to want to go." She thought about it. "When?" "Depends on how much longer we have." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it she'd learned to hear by now, a tightness, a calculation. "The mortgage Holloway arranged on the ranch, I got a look at the ledger during the audit. The terms are worse than I thought. There's a balloon payment due in April. If the ranch can't make it, he'd have the bank foreclose," she said, "and collect on the ranch's assets in the chaos. All the supplies he's been siphoning would just be absorbed into the confusion." He folded the sketch and put it in his shirt pocket. "We don't have until spring, Mara. We have 6, maybe 8 weeks." She sat with that. Outside, February was doing its gray, relentless thing against the kitchen windows. She could hear men moving in the yard, the ordinary sounds of a ranch morning, horses and boots, and the far-off complaint of a gate hinge. "Send Riverhawk," she said, "as soon as he can go." The thing Holloway did, she hadn't expected because it was stupid, and she'd made the mistake of assuming he wasn't. He waited until Riverhawk was 3 days gone toward Casper before he made his move, which meant he'd known, or suspected, and let Riverhawk go because it suited his timing. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of February, a hand named Drury, one of the ones she'd never been able to read, not with Holloway and not with anyone else, came to the kitchen and told her there was a problem with the springhouse pipe. The springhouse sat a quarter-mile up a slope behind the north barn, a small stone building that kept the perishables in cold weather, and the pipe that fed it from the hillside spring had been giving trouble all winter. "Holloway says, can you check it?" Drury said. "Might be some of your stores in there going bad if the temperature's off." She should have said no. She thought about saying no for about half a second, weighing it, and then thought, if I refuse everything suspicious, I'll have refused my way into looking guilty without them having to do anything else. So she took her coat and went. The springhouse was small and dark and cold, built into the slope so that the stone walls were half underground. The door was low, you had to duck to enter, and the interior was dim even in daylight, lit only by what came in through the door and 2 narrow slits in the stone. She stepped inside and saw immediately that the pipe was fine. The stores were fine. There was no problem of any kind. She was turning to leave when the door swung shut behind her. She heard the bar drop on the outside. For a second, she just stood there in the dark and cold, her hand still reaching back toward where the door had been. The sound of the bar settling into its bracket was very ordinary, very final. She didn't panic. She almost did. Her heart went somewhere fast and wrong for a few seconds, but she found her feet under her and stood still and breathed and listened. Voices outside. Holloway's, she was almost certain, though the stone muffled things. and Drury's, and at least one other. She felt along the wall. The spring house had been built for keeping things cold and accessible, not for holding people, but the stone was 18 inches thick and the door was solid oak with iron hinges. She tried the door, braced both feet and pushed, just to know how bad it was. It didn't move at all. She thought about what was in the spring house: shelves of crocks, a sack of potatoes, root vegetables she'd brought up last week, a barrel of brine with pork in it, tools. There were always tools in outbuildings on working ranches. She started feeling along the shelves in the dark, methodical, not rushing. She found a pry bar behind the potato sack. Not long, maybe 18 inches, but solid iron. She thought about the hinges. The hinges were on the outside. She thought about the bar across the door, also outside. She thought about the stone walls and concluded that the only thing more humiliating than being locked in a spring house would be being found in a collapsed spring house. So she wasn't going to do anything structural. She thought about what Thorne had said. Whatever's happening here, it's been happening a long time. She thought about her notebook under the floorboard in her room, thought about the copy and the carpetbag lining, thought about Riverhawk 3 days into a ride toward Casper. She could hear Holloway's voice outside more clearly now. He was talking to someone, and she caught fragments, supplies, ledger, and her signature, and something she couldn't quite hear, and then clear enough for the marshal. So that was it. He was going to produce something with her name on it, a falsified record, probably. The kind of thing that was easier to believe when the accused was locked in a spring house and couldn't answer back. She gripped the pry bar and thought, the door's weak point wasn't the bar or the hinges. It was the bracket the bar rested in, which was fastened to the door frame with 4 bolts. The door frame was stone. She couldn't do anything with that. But if the bracket was iron bolted into a wooden frame set in the stone, and if the wood was old enough, which it was, because everything on this ranch that wasn't actively maintained was older than it should be, she found the inner edge of the door with her fingers, felt along the side where the frame met the stone. Old wood, cold and slightly damp. She worked the tip of the pry bar into the gap between the door and the frame and leaned on it with everything she had. It didn't give. She adjusted her angle, tried again. Something creaked deep in the wood, a sound like an old complaint finally being voiced. She stopped, listened. The voices outside had paused. Then she heard something else. A third voice. Lower, quieter. And then Holloway's, sharper now, a different note in it. She pressed her ear to the door. Have no business here. Holloway. Tight. The third voice said something she couldn't hear. Callow, I don't know what you think you... Open the door, Thorne said, clearly enough that she heard every word. Now. A pause that lasted longer than it should have. She's in there for her own protection while I conduct an investigation into... Open it, Thorne said, or I'll open it myself and you can explain to every man on this ranch why your cook is locked in the spring house. She heard Drury's voice, nervous, saying something low that she couldn't catch. She heard boots on frozen ground, then the sound she'd been waiting for, the bar lifting. The door swung open and the gray February light came in, thin and cold, and she stepped out with the pry bar still in her hand and took in the scene in a single sweep. Thorne stood 6 feet from the door, and he looked like a different man than the one she'd been looking at for 4 months. Not physically different, same worn clothes, same weathered face, but he was standing differently. The quality of absence she'd come to associate with him, that careful way he had of taking up as little space as possible, was completely gone. He was standing like a man on his own land, which was exactly what he was. Holloway was 2 feet to his right, and for the first time since October, he looked uncertain. Drury was behind Holloway, looking at the pry bar in Mara's hand with an expression that suggested he'd just recalculated several things about the afternoon. There was a fourth man she hadn't expected, Calder, a few yards back, holding a piece of paper. The falsified record, she assumed. He was looking at Thorne with an expression she didn't entirely understand. Not guilt, something more complicated. The expression of a man who'd made a bad bet and was watching it come undone. Mara, Thorne said, not looking away from Holloway. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said. She stepped fully out of the spring house and straightened up. I found a pry bar. Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face. Holloway looked between them. The calculation was visible. She could almost watch him running through his options. His eyes moved to Calder and the paper, then back to Thorne, then to the pry bar, then to the distance between himself and the barn. "This doesn't change anything," he said. His voice had the sound of a man saying something he knew wasn't true. "I own this ranch," Thorne said. Quiet, direct, not louder than a normal speaking voice, which somehow made it harder. "I have the deed in my name. The mortgage you arranged is a fraud. You didn't have authority to bind this property. The supplies you've been moving to the relay station off the Casper Road are stolen property, and I have a witness who can describe the layout of what's stored there." He paused. "You've had 2 years of my inattention. You don't have it anymore." Holloway stared at him for a long moment. Behind him, Calder let the paper drop to his side. "You can't prove," Holloway started. "I have her records," Thorne said, and the her was pointed, deliberate. "Every delivery shortage, dated against initials on your wagon logs. I have a signed written account of a witness who followed your wagon to the relay station. I have a ledger entry in Briggs's handwriting that was added after the fact." He tilted his head slightly. "And I have the deed, which you've never had." The silence after that had a particular texture. The cold air moved through it. A horse stamped in the distant barn. Somewhere above them on the slope, a bird, something small and untroubled, made a short sound and stopped. It was Drury who moved first. He took 2 steps back and then turned and walked toward the bunkhouse at a pace that wasn't quite running but was pointed clearly in the direction of not being here anymore. Calder looked at Holloway and then at the ground and then at no one in particular. "I didn't know about the mortgage," he said, to no one in particular. It was the most pathetic thing Mara had heard in months. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Holloway looked at Thorne, and something final settled in his expression. Not defeat, exactly. The man wasn't built for defeat in the way normal people understood it. It was more like a closing, doors shutting behind windows, shutting behind whatever calculation he'd been running. "You have a cook and a horsebreaker and a piece of paper," he said. "This territory has judges, Callow, and lawyers, and men who've been working this ranch for years and know who's actually been running it." "Yes," Thorne said. "They do know that. I'll be interested to hear what they have to say about it." Holloway walked away, past the barn toward the main house, not hurrying. The back of him was composed and deliberate and said clearly that this was not over. He was right about that. But he was right in a smaller, more desperate way than he knew. By sundown, Iron Ridge was a different place. Not better exactly. Things don't get better that fast, and she'd lived enough life to know that. But different. The kind of different that happens after a thing that's been held underground finally surfaces, when the ground settles unevenly and everyone has to find new footing. Thorne called the hands together in the yard an hour before dinner. All of them, the ones who'd believed Mara, and the ones who hadn't, and the ones who'd tried not to have an opinion, and the ones who'd actively worked against her. He stood in front of them in the gray late daylight and told them who he was. He didn't make a speech of it. He told them the facts in the same flat, measured voice he used for everything else. And the shock that went through the assembled men had a particular quality, the shock of people realizing they've been looking at something every day without seeing it. Eddie Pierce's face went through about 6 expressions in 10 seconds. He ended up somewhere that looked like relief. Briggs and 2 others went to their quarters without eating dinner. She counted that as a form of answer. The rest of them stood in the cold and looked at Thorne, and then at Mara, and then at each other. And then they started asking questions, practical ones, anxious ones, the kind of questions men ask when the ground shifts and they want to know if their jobs are safe. He answered them honestly, including the ones where the honest answer was, "I don't know yet." She served dinner late. Nobody complained. Afterward, when the kitchen was as clean as she could get it and the stoves were banked for the night, she sat at the far table, his usual spot, and felt the tiredness of the day settle into her bones. It wasn't a bad tired. It was the tired of someone who'd been holding something heavy and had finally been allowed to put part of it down. Thorne came in after she'd been sitting there 20 minutes. He looked at her in his chair and sat across from her instead, which was a small thing that was somehow not small. He poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one toward her. "Riverhawk should reach Casper tomorrow," he said. "And the marshal?" 3 days out, if things go smoothly. Longer if they don't. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Holloway won't wait that long." "No," he said. "He won't." He looked at her directly. "I want you to be careful. Whatever he does next, it'll be fast, and it'll be when you're not expecting it. I'm always expecting it, she said. More careful than that, then. She almost smiled. I had a pry bar. You did, he said. I noticed. The kitchen was warm. Outside it had started snowing, light, dry, the kind of snow that makes the world go very quiet. She could hear it against the windows in the way you can only hear silence made more silent. Thorn, she said. You came for me. He was quiet a moment. Of course I did, he said, as if this were obvious. As if there were no other way it could have been. She looked at her coffee. There were things she could have said, things that would have been true and probably relevant and possibly important. She didn't say them. She didn't need to, yet. There was still too much undone, and she'd learned to put things in the right order when she could. 3 days, she said instead. We just have to hold 3 more days. 3 days, he agreed. She finished her coffee. He finished his. The snow came down outside Iron Ridge in the dark, covering everything temporarily, the way snow does, making the world look cleaner than it is, hiding all the tracks, and giving everyone who was still standing a few quiet hours before whatever came next. It was, she had to admit, almost beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful right before they get very bad. The snow that had fallen so quietly through the night was gone by morning, melted off by a Chinook wind that came down from the mountains warm and wrong for February, turning the yard to mud and making the horses restless in their stalls. Mara noticed the wind when she woke before 4. She lay there a moment listening to it work against the kitchen walls and thought about what Thorn had said. Whatever he does next, it'll be fast, and it'll be when you're not expecting it. She got up, lit the lamp, started the stoves. The first day after Thorn's declaration had a strange, suspended quality to it, like the ranch was holding its breath. The hands went about their work with a carefulness that wasn't normal, talking less than usual, watching each other, and watching the main house where Holloway had been seen going in and not coming out. Briggs had disappeared entirely. One of the other men who'd been in Holloway's circle, a hand named Voss, showed up at breakfast with his gear packed and his horse saddled and left without a word to anyone. That was its own kind of information, Calder stayed. She wasn't sure what to make of that. He came to meals, sat at the far end of the table away from everyone, ate without speaking, and went back to work. He wasn't carrying Holloway's water anymore. She could feel the absence of it in the way he avoided her eyes, rather than watching her with that deliberate measurement he'd had before. He looked like a man who'd realized he'd been standing on the wrong side of a line and was hoping nobody would make a formal announcement of it. She kept her notebook on her at all times. She checked the floorboard twice a day. She made herself stay in the kitchen after dark and bolt the door. Thorn, for his part, had stepped into his own name in a way that was still slightly uncomfortable to watch. Like a man putting on a coat he'd left hanging for too long, finding it still fit, but not quite the way he remembered. He was in the main house now, going through the financial documents. He came to the kitchen for meals same as before, but he sat at the near table instead of the far end, and the other hands arranged themselves differently around him, the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet. Once you acknowledge the magnet is there. He told her what he was finding in the ledgers. It was worse than he'd expected. Holloway had borrowed against the ranch's assets in 4 separate instruments over 18 months. Not just the one mortgage she knew about, but 3 additional notes at a lending firm in Casper, using what appeared to be Thorn's forged signature. The total debt was substantial enough that if it came due simultaneously and the ranch couldn't pay, the lenders would have first claim on the land, the livestock, the buildings. Everything. He was going to take the ranch bankrupt, she said. They were sitting at the near table, late, after dinner was cleared. He'd brought the ledger and was showing her the entries. Drain the assets, default on the notes, let the lenders foreclose. And he'd have had an arrangement with whoever bought it at auction, Thorn said. Most likely the lending firm itself, which he may have had a share in. He turned a page. I can't prove that last part yet, but the structure of it points that way. She looked at the ledger, at the signatures that were supposed to be his, the careful forgeries that had probably taken some practice to produce. How long did this take him to build? He started within 6 months of my wife dying, Thorn said, and said it without inflection, the way you say a thing you've had time to get used to. He was patient about it. He's patient about everything, she said. Yes. He closed the ledger. which is why I don't think he's done. She'd been thinking the same thing. Holloway had walked away from the spring house with his plan exposed and his allies scattering, but the man she'd been watching for 4 months didn't fold. He recalculated. He was somewhere in that main house right now, or somewhere on this ranch, running numbers on what he still had and what he could still do before the marshal arrived. "The deed," she said, "and the financial documents. Where are you keeping them?" "I have the deed on me," he said. He touched his coat, indicating an interior pocket. "The ledgers are in the main house, but I can't watch them every hour." "He'll go for those," she said. "If he can take the original documents, he can muddy the picture enough to buy time," Thorne agreed. "Or destroy them entirely and claim I'm presenting forged records." She thought about that. "Can we move them somewhere he doesn't know about?" "The question is where. He knows this property better than I do right now, which is a thing I'm still getting used to." He said that last part with a flatness that had some bitterness underneath it, honest bitterness, the kind that knows its own source. She thought about the kitchen, the floorboard, the places a man like Holloway wouldn't think to look because he'd never had reason to pay attention to a kitchen. "Bring the ledgers here," she said. "Tonight. There's a loose board under the cold storage shelf in the back room. It's big enough." He looked at her. "He spent 4 months looking past me," she said. "He can spend a few more days doing the same." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the thing that comes before one. "All right," he said. He brought the ledgers after midnight while the ranch slept. She was still up, waiting, and she took them and wrapped them in oilcloth she'd been saving for exactly this kind of purpose without knowing it. And she put them under the board in the back room and pressed the board flat and stacked 2 crates of dried beans on top of it. Then she went to bed and lay there listening to the Chinook wind and thinking about 3 days. 2 days now. The second day was when Calder came to find her. She was in the supply shed doing her Tuesday count when she heard him come in, and she turned around slowly because she'd promised herself she'd stop turning fast when someone came through a door unexpectedly, that it showed too much. He stood inside the door with his hat in his hands. He looked worse than he had at breakfast, less composed, the kind of tired that wasn't about sleep. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I didn't know about the forged signatures," he said. "I want that clear. I knew about the supply runs to the relay station because Holloway told me it was ranch business. Overflow storage," he said, while he negotiated a new supply contract. He stopped. "I should have asked more questions. I didn't." "No," she said. "You didn't." He nodded, taking that. "Last night, late, after you were asleep, I saw Holloway in the yard. He wasn't going to the outhouse, and he wasn't getting a drink of water." He paused. "He was going toward the main barn. I followed him. He spent about an hour in there, in the far back where there's a feed room nobody uses much. When he came out, he was carrying something, a canvas bag, looked heavy." She felt that in her chest. "You didn't follow him after?" "I lost him in the dark. He went east toward the fence line." He turned his hat in his hands. "I don't know what was in the bag, but I don't think it was feed." She kept her voice steady. "Thank you, Calder." He nodded once and left quickly, and she stood in the supply shed and thought about what might be in a heavy canvas bag that a desperate man carried into the dark. Payroll. The ranch kept the hands' monthly wages in the main house safe. She knew this because Thorne had mentioned it when they were going through the documents. Cash and coin. Enough for 40-some men's wages, plus whatever operating funds Holloway had kept there. And the land deeds, the original property documents that predated any of Holloway's fraudulent notes. She found Thorne in the main house and told him. He went very still, in the particular way of him, and then he went to the safe. It was behind a panel in the study, and he knew the combination, and he opened it and looked inside. "Payroll's gone," he said. "The original land survey documents, too." He checked the interior carefully. "He left the mortgage notes. The ones with the forged signature." "Of course he did," she said. "Those are his evidence, not yours." He closed the safe and stood there a moment. "He's building his exit," he said. "Cash to run on. Documents to discredit whatever I present to the marshal." He turned. "If he gets to Casper before Riverhawk does." "He might already be on his way," she said. They looked at each other. "I'll take the east fence line," Thorne said. "If Calder saw him go that way—" "You can't go alone," she said. If he's armed and cornered, I'll take Eddie. Eddie's 19. Eddie's also a good shot, Thorne said, and something in his voice told her this was not a point open for further discussion. He put his coat on and checked the revolver at his hip. She'd known he carried one, but hadn't seen him reach for it before, and the naturalness of it told her it wasn't as unfamiliar as his laborer's clothes had suggested. She wanted to say something about being careful and didn't, because it would come out wrong. "The marshal," she said instead. "Riverhawk's bringing him from Casper. If Holloway gets there first and talks to the right people." "I know," he said. He was heading for the door. "Thorne!" He stopped and turned. She held his gaze. "Come back," she said. Straightforward, no decoration on it. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. He left. She stood in the study of the main house, the room she'd never been in before, with its cold fireplace and its dusty furniture and the quality of a space that had been abandoned in the middle of a life, and listened to his boots on the porch and then the yard. Then she went back to the kitchen because there was nothing else she could do and she needed to think, and she thought best when her hands were moving. She made bread. She didn't need bread. She'd made 2 batches earlier in the week, but she needed to do something with her hands that required enough attention to keep her brain from chewing on itself. She measured flour and salt, worked the starter in, found the particular rhythm of bread making that lived somewhere below conscious thought, and let it carry her. She was on her second hour of it when she heard the door. Not a knock. Just the door opening, the specific weight of it, and then footsteps that weren't Thorne's, and weren't Eddie's, and weren't any of the hands she'd memorized over 4 months. She knew them in the half-second before she turned around, the way you sometimes know a thing in your body before your mind gets to it. Holloway stood in the kitchen doorway. He had the canvas bag over one shoulder and a pistol in his hand, and he looked like a man who'd been outside for hours. His coat was wet at the shoulders from where the Chinook had turned back to cold drizzle. His boots were muddy. His face had the pressed, thinned look of someone running out of options at speed. But his hand was steady. That was the part she paid attention to. She didn't move from the bread table. Her hands were still in the dough. "I need supplies," he said. "Enough to make Casper." She looked at him, looked at the gun. "Kitchen's open," she said. He moved inside, keeping her in his sightline, and went to the shelves. He started taking things with his free hand. A wrapped piece of salt pork, a sack of hardtack she kept for the hands who rode out early. He was efficient about it. Not panicked, not shaking. That was the thing about Holloway. Even at the end of something, he was functional. It was almost impressive in a way that made her stomach turn. "Where's Callow?" he said. "I don't know," she said. Which was true. He looked at her with the flat gray eyes. "You're a terrible liar." "I'm not lying. He went out and I don't know exactly where." He put the hardtack in the bag and turned back to her. "You know what the problem with you is?" he said, and his voice had slipped into something almost conversational, the way people get when they're past the point of maintaining a performance. "You were supposed to be easy. A widow, no connections, no local standing. I've handled 6 women who've worked this kitchen, and every one of them either did what they were told or left when things got uncomfortable." He tilted his head. "You kept records." "I did," she said. "Stupid," he said. "Not the records, the timing. If you'd started 6 months earlier, I might have been more careful." The stove was to her left. 2 of the burners were lit. She'd been baking, and the oven was still hot. On the back burner was a pot of water she'd set to heat for washing up, and it had been simmering for 40 minutes. She kept her hands in the bread dough and kept her eyes on his and thought about what was between her and the back burner. "The land deeds," she said. "The ones you took from the safe." He didn't answer. "You can't use them," she said. "If you go to Casper and try to present forged documents against a man who has the original deed to his own property, in a territory where the marshal is already on his way here with a sworn witness." "The marshal isn't on his way," he said. "I have a man at the telegraph office. If Riverhawk sent a wire, I'd know." "He didn't send a wire," she said. "He rode." The pause that followed was small but real. She watched it move through him. "You're bluffing," he said. "Riverhawk left 5 days ago on horseback," she said. "He should be in Casper by now." He carried a written statement and a letter from Thorne Callow, identifying himself as the owner of Iron Ridge Ranch and requesting immediate attention to fraud and theft. She paused. You can get to Casper, but so can the marshal. And when he gets here, he's going to find records in this kitchen that account for every shortage, every falsified delivery, every item in that relay station on the North Road. He was looking at her differently now. The conversational quality was gone. Move away from the stove, he said. She moved. Not the way he wanted her to. She moved toward it rather than away. One step to her left, her hip near the back burner, her right hand coming out of the bread dough. Stop, he said, and the gun came up. She stopped. Her right hand was floury and empty, and her hip was 6 inches from the pot handle. You're going to shoot the cook, she said. In her own kitchen, with 40 witnesses on this ranch who already know you locked her in a spring house yesterday. You're going to move away from that stove, he said, very controlled. Or what? She said. You're out of road, Mr. Holloway. You've got cash and stolen deeds and no allies left on this ranch. Shooting me makes it worse, not better. He stared at her. The gun didn't waver, but his eyes did, just slightly, just enough. And in that half second, she picked up the pot handle with her flour-white hand and threw the contents at him, not at him. At the floor between them and his gun hand, the hot water hitting the stone floor and the steam coming up sudden and sharp. And he flinched back and the gun jerked sideways and she was already moving, around the preparation table, putting the solid oak between them. She grabbed the cast iron skillet off the hook by feel. She knew that kitchen the way she knew her own hands, and brought it up and had it raised before he'd fully recovered his footing on the wet floor. Drop the gun, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The skillet was heavy, 12 pounds of cast iron, and her arm was shaking slightly from the weight of it, but she held it steady because she was not going to let it shake where he could see. I will hit you with this, she said. I have been cooking on a logging camp since I was 22, and I have lifted this skillet every day for 4 months, and my arm is stronger than it looks. He believed her. She could see it happen. The gun lowered, not dropped. He wasn't quite there yet, but lowered, the barrel pointing at the floor. That was when the kitchen door opened and Eddie Pierce came through it at speed and stopped dead when he saw the scene. Holloway wet and off balance, Mara with her skillet, the gun at half-mast between them. And for a second the three of them formed a tableau that would have been almost comic if the gun weren't real. Eddie, to his credit, didn't freeze more than a second. He had his own revolver out. She hadn't known he'd been carrying it, and she made a note to ask him about that when this was over. And he pointed it at Holloway with the two-handed grip of someone who'd practiced but not necessarily used it in earnest. Mr. Holloway, Eddie said, his voice cracking slightly on the second syllable before he steadied it. Put it down. Holloway looked at Eddie, looked at Mara and the skillet, looked at the wet floor and the steam still rising from it, made the calculation that was available to him. He put the gun on the table. She exhaled. Her arm dropped. The skillet weighed about twice as much as it had a minute ago, and she set it on the stove and stood there for a moment just breathing. Good job, she said to Eddie. Are you... He started. I'm fine, she said. Where's Thorne? Coming. He's about 2 minutes behind me. We found where Holloway had been. East fence line. He'd had a horse tied there. It's gone, so he must have... Eddie looked at Holloway. Changed his plan. He needed supplies, she said. He came back for supplies. She looked at Holloway, who was standing in her kitchen in his wet coat with his gun on her table, and she felt something she hadn't expected, which was exhaustion without satisfaction. She'd wanted this to feel like winning. It didn't feel like anything yet, except very, very tired. Thorne came through the door 90 seconds later, breathing hard from the run. He took in the scene, Eddie with the gun, Holloway disarmed, Mara at the stove with her flour-white hands, and stopped. He looked at her. The pot, he said, noticing the empty pot on the floor, the wet stones, the steam. Hot water, she said. He looked at Holloway. Something moved across his face that was old and complicated and not entirely anger. There was a kind of grief underneath it, she thought, the grief of someone who'd trusted badly and paid for it over years. Sit down, Grant, he said. Grant. And Holloway, who had run this ranch for 2 years, who had built his scheme brick by careful brick, who had locked her in a spring house and forged a man's name on 4 separate documents and smuggled supplies off his own employer's ranch for 18 months, sat down at the kitchen table like a man who was simply too tired to stand anymore. Thorne pulled a length of rope from his coat pocket. She didn't ask why he had it. Men who worked ranches carried rope the way other people carried handkerchiefs. He tied Holloway's hands to the chair back efficiently, without ceremony. Then he stood back and looked at the canvas bag on the floor. He took the payroll, Mara said, and the original survey documents. Thorne picked up the bag and looked inside. It's here, he said. He looked at her. Both. She nodded, let out a breath. The four of them stayed in the kitchen, Mara and Thorne and Eddie and Holloway tied to the chair, while the night pressed against the windows and the stove ticked in the way stoves tick when they're cooling, and the Chinook wind outside finally settled down to something that wasn't quite a storm and wasn't quite calm either. By the time the first gray edge of dawn appeared over the mountains, the marshal had not yet arrived, and they were still sitting there, and nobody had slept, and the bread she'd been making was overproofed and ruined on the table. But none of that felt like the point. 3 hands came to the kitchen door when the light came up, among them River Hawk, who looked like a man who had ridden very hard for 5 days and needed both food and sleep in that order. Marshall's 2 hours out, he said, from the doorway, taking in the scene with the systematic calm of someone who'd trained himself not to react to unexpected things. His eyes moved from Holloway to the rope to Mara's flour-covered hands to Eddie's revolver still on the table. Good, Thorne said. Riverhawk looked at Mara. She looked at him. He gave the smallest nod she'd seen since Thorne's nod in the Springhouse yard, which was the nod of someone who understood that a great deal had happened in 5 days, and most of it had been handled. Is there coffee? He said. She almost laughed. There's always coffee, she said, and turned to the stove. The sun came up over Iron Ridge slow and pale and cold, the way Wyoming suns did in February. Not warming anything yet, just making things visible. In the kitchen, the lamp was still burning, which made the dawn look even thinner by contrast. She could hear the ranch waking up outside, the ordinary sounds of it, and those sounds had a different quality now that she couldn't quite name. Not better, not fixed, just different, like a thing that had been wrong for a long time was in the process of being corrected, which is its own kind of feeling. Not triumphant, more like the relief of a bone being set. It hurts while it's happening, and then it starts, slowly, to heal. She poured coffee for Riverhawk and for Eddie and for Thorne and set a cup on the table near Holloway's tied hands, because she was not going to be the kind of person who withheld coffee from a tied man in her kitchen on a cold morning, not even this one. He looked at the cup. He didn't say anything. He didn't say thank you, and she didn't expect him to. But he drank it. 2 hours later, when the marshal's horses came up the long lane to Iron Ridge Ranch, the yard was full of men who'd been waiting, some because they were anxious, some because they were guilty, some because they were simply tired of not knowing what happened next. Mara stood on the kitchen porch with her notebook in one hand and Riverhawk's written statement in the other and watched them come. She was still wearing her work apron. Her hands were still faintly white with flour. The bread she'd ruined was still on the table behind her. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd been up all night in her kitchen, who'd kept her records and held her ground and thrown hot water at a man with a gun, and who was still standing, which was, all things considered, enough. Marshal Cord Devers was a compact man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and the particular unhurried quality of someone who had seen enough emergencies to know that moving faster than necessary rarely helped. He rode in ahead of his 2 deputies and took in the yard full of cowhands and the kitchen porch, and Mara standing on it with her notebook and apron, and he dismounted without any visible surprise and handed his reins to the nearest person, which happened to be Eddie Pierce. He looked at Mara. "You the cook?" he said. "I am," she said. "Riverhawk told me you'd have records." "I have records," she said, and held out the notebook. He took it, opened it, read the first page with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at, and then looked up. "Where's the man in question?" "Tied to a chair in my kitchen," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "And you are?" "Mara Whitlock. I've been the cook here since October." He said, which wasn't agreement or disagreement, but the sound of a man filing information. He closed the notebook and kept it, and walked past her into the kitchen. She followed him in. Thorne was standing near the window, and Holloway was still at the table, still tied, the empty coffee cup in front of him. The marshal looked at Holloway the way a man looks at a familiar type of problem. Grant Holloway, he said. Not a question. Marshall, Holloway said. His voice was steady. She had to give him that. Whatever else he was, the man didn't fall apart easily. I've got a signed statement from a Mr. Riverhawk describing stolen ranch supplies stored at an abandoned relay station on the North Casper Road, the marshal said. I've got a cook's record showing systematic inventory shortages over 4 months. And I've got a Mr. Thorne Callow here who tells me this is his property, and he has a deed to prove it. He pulled a chair out and sat down across from Holloway, like they were about to have a civilized conversation. You want to tell me your version, or should I just read the ledger? Holloway looked at the marshal, looked at Thorne. Something final settled in his face, the look of a man closing accounts. I want a lawyer, he said. You'll get one, the marshal said. In Casper. He nodded to his deputies, and they came forward, and one of them untied the rope from the chair and replaced it with iron cuffs. Holloway stood, and the deputies walked him out through the kitchen door, past the assembled hands who'd gathered in the yard, and the watching that happened in that moment was very quiet and very complete. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go. She'd expected to feel something larger, vindication maybe, or the particular satisfaction of seeing a thing end that had caused a lot of damage. What she felt instead was smaller and more complicated. She felt tired. She felt relieved. She felt sad in a way she couldn't entirely explain. The sadness of looking at a person who'd had some capability and spent all of it on the wrong thing, which was a waste she found genuinely depressing regardless of who it was. She turned back to the kitchen. Thorne was talking quietly with the marshal, presenting the deed, the ledger with the forged signatures, the documentation Riverhawk had brought back from Casper detailing the lending arrangements. The marshal went through it all with the same unhurried attention and took everything into his custody and gave Thorne a receipt for each item, which struck her as the most orderly thing she'd seen in weeks. When the marshal left 2 hours later, he took Holloway and Briggs, who'd been found in the bunkhouse having never actually left, and 3 additional men who'd been directly involved in the supply runs. He left behind a deputy to stay through the week, which Thorne said he appreciated, which was a considerable understatement. The ranch stood in the February quiet and looked at itself. The weeks that followed were not triumphant. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, because she'd found that people had a tendency to smooth over the aftermath of hard things and make it sound like resolution was immediate and complete. And it wasn't. It was messy and slow and full of small problems that didn't care about the large ones that had just been resolved. There were legal proceedings to deal with, depositions taken, documents submitted, 2 separate trips to Casper for Thorne and Riverhawk to give formal testimony. The mortgage fraud took time to untangle because the lending firm had its own lawyers who didn't simply accept Thorne's claim that the notes had been fraudulently obtained, and there were several months of correspondence and hearings before it was settled in Thorne's favor. The stolen payroll was recovered from the canvas bag, but some of the operating funds Holloway had moved through other accounts were genuinely gone, and the ranch had to run lean through the spring while that was sorted out. Calder stayed, and she was still uncertain how she felt about that. He worked hard and asked for nothing, and caused no trouble, and never tried to explain himself beyond what he'd already said in the supply shed. She'd decided, eventually, that people who made bad decisions from cowardice rather than malice deserved the chance to make better ones, if they actually did. He was making better ones. She'd note it without making it into something more than it was. Voss, who'd left the morning after Thorne's declaration, was found to have been involved in the relay station operation and was arrested in a town 30 miles west. She didn't feel much about that either way. Eddie Pierce got a $10 bonus out of the recovered payroll, which Thorne gave him without explanation. Eddie tried to refuse it, and Thorne told him to put it in his pocket and stop arguing, and that was that. Riverhawk stayed on as the ranch's lead horsebreaker, which was what he'd been before and what he was good at, and the difference now was simply that his judgment was openly consulted rather than privately ignored. He didn't make a thing of it. He never made a thing of anything, which she respected enormously. The main house was where things got complicated. It was March before Thorne opened it properly. She knew he'd been going into work to access the study and the documents and the ranch accounts that needed his attention, but the rest of the house had stayed shuttered, the way it had been since 1878. She didn't push. She'd learned with him that some doors opened on their own schedule, and pushing them damaged the hinges. One evening in mid-March, she came back from the supply shed to find him standing on the main house porch in the particular way of someone who's been standing somewhere for a while. The shutters on the front windows were open. She stopped in the yard and looked at them. He was looking at them too, as if he wasn't entirely sure when that had happened. She walked up to the porch and stood beside him. The light inside was on, just the study lamp, visible through the now open front window, and it made the house look inhabited in a way it hadn't since she'd arrived. "I opened them," he said. "The shutters. I didn't plan to. I was coming out for air, and I just—" He stopped. "Looks good," she said. He looked at her. "It's a mess in there. The furniture's been under sheets for 5 years. I've cleaned worse." "I didn't mean—" He stopped again. Looked at the open window. "I don't know what I meant." She sat on the porch step. He looked at her for a moment and then sat beside her, which put them close together in the cold March evening with the yard dark in front of them and the lit window behind. "She would have hated what I let happen," he said. Not dramatically, just plainly. "To the ranch, to myself." He was quiet a moment. She was practical. She would have told me to get up off the floor years ago. "Maybe," Mara said. "People who loved you well tend to be clear-eyed about you." He looked at her sideways. "Is that your general observation or a specific one?" "Bit of both," she said. The silence between them was comfortable, which it had been for months, but there was something different in it tonight. The open shutters had changed something, some quality of the air, the way a room feels different when you take down the curtains you've been hiding behind. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. When you took this job, the ad in the post office in Casper, he seemed to be working something out. Was this what you expected?" She thought about it honestly. "I expected a working ranch kitchen and a difficult foreman," she said. "I expected to spend my first 6 months proving I wasn't going anywhere." She paused. "I didn't expect any of the rest of it." "No," he said. "Neither did I." Another silence. A horse moved in the far barn. The March wind was cold but not brutal, not Wyoming winter cold, just the regular cold of a place that didn't soften easily. "Mara," he said. "Yes." He turned to look at her directly, which he did less often than you might expect from a man who paid such close attention. "I'd like you to stay." She met his eyes. "I am staying." "I mean—" He stopped. Tried again, in the way of a man who was precise with words but found certain categories of them difficult. "I mean, in a different capacity than cook." She looked at him for a moment. "You're going to have to be clearer than that, Thorne." "I know," he said. He looked at his hands. "I'm not good at this. I haven't had to be in a long time." "I know you're not good at it," she said. "I'm not particularly good at it either." She turned back to the yard. "But I think you should try anyway." He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she'd miscalculated, and then he said, "I would like it if you would consider building something here, with me, whatever that looks like." He paused. "I'm aware that's not— I know it's not a polished way to put it." "It's an honest way to put it," she said. "I like honest." She looked at the open window, at the light inside the house. She thought about the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, which she'd gotten used to, and which was hers in the way that rented things were yours, functionally, temporarily. She thought about Thomas, which she did less often now than she used to, and when she did, it wasn't the raw kind of thinking anymore, but the quieter kind, the kind where you could see someone clearly without the grief distorting the image. He'd been a decent man who'd made bad choices. She'd loved him and buried him and kept living, which was what you did. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "I'll consider it. I've been considering it for a while, if I'm being honest." "How long?" he said. "Sometime around when you made the comfrey salve," she said. Something happened in his face that she hadn't seen before. A shift, genuine and unguarded. The expression of a man who'd forgotten he was capable of that particular kind of warmth and was surprised to find it was still there. It wasn't a large expression. It was his scale of expression, which was small and exact, and it was the most readable she'd ever seen him. They sat on the porch a while longer. Eventually she got cold and went inside, into the main house, which she'd never been in outside the study, and found the kitchen, which was dusty and cold and larger than the cookhouse, and had a good stove under its sheets. She lit it, and it worked, which she took as a reasonable sign. Well, they married in June, in the practical way of people with work to do and not much patience for ceremony. A circuit judge came through, and Eddie Pierce and Riverhawk stood as witnesses, and it was done in 20 minutes in the study of the main house, with the windows open and the Wyoming summer coming in warm and dry. Eddie cried, which he denied afterward with some heat, and which everyone present ignored. The cookhouse became a proper kitchen for the hands, with a hired assistant cook named Pearl, who was 17 and learning fast and reminded Mara of herself in the useful ways rather than the painful ones. Mara moved into the main house and spent 3 weeks cleaning it room by room, uncovering furniture that was better than she'd expected. Solid pieces, built to last, bought by people who'd meant to stay, and airing out 5 years of closed-up grief until the house smelled like a house again, instead of a monument. She found things that told her about Clara, Thorne's wife, without him having to explain. A needlework sampler half finished in a sewing basket, a row of books in the bedroom with their spines cracked from reading, a kitchen garden layout drawn on paper tucked into the kitchen drawer, the handwriting quick and sure. She mentioned the garden plan to Thorne, and he told her Clara had always meant to put it in, but they'd had a hard spring that year, and then she'd gotten sick. Mara put the garden in that summer, not as a gesture exactly, or not only as one, but because it was a good garden plan, and the ground was right for it, and she liked growing things. Things grew. That was not a metaphor, or not only one. Iron Ridge in the years that followed was not a storybook place. Let's be precise about that. There were drought years when the cattle prices dropped, and they had to make hard choices about the herd. There was a winter when a sickness went through the horses, and they lost 4 of their best animals, and Riverhawk barely slept for a month. There was a legal dispute with a neighboring ranch over water rights that dragged on for 2 years and cost money they'd rather have spent on something else. Pearl got married and left, which was good for Pearl and inconvenient for everyone else. People came and went. Some of the hands who'd been there through Holloway's time stayed for years and became something like family. Riverhawk, obviously, and Eddie, who grew into a solid and reliable man and eventually ran the North Cattle operation and bought his own 20 acres adjacent to the ranch and came to dinner on Sundays. Others left and were replaced by others, the ordinary turnover of working life. Calder stayed longer than she'd expected. He never talked about the Holloway years directly, and she never brought it up. He worked the fence lines and the boundary jobs, not because anyone assigned them to him, but because he seemed to have decided that was his penance, and she wasn't going to argue with whatever system of accounting worked for him. He left eventually, in his own time, and shook Thorne's hand on his way out, and nothing more was said about it. Holloway went to trial in Casper in the fall of that year. The fraud charges were the most serious. The forged signatures on 4 financial instruments was the kind of crime that territorial judges took severely. He received 7 years and was sent to the territorial penitentiary, and she did not go to the trial because she'd given her testimony in written form, and that was enough. She didn't need to see the verdict to know it had happened. She didn't think about him much. She thought about him sometimes. Couldn't help it, the way you think about any experience that came close enough to hurt you. But it was the impersonal thinking you do about weather that's past. He'd been a thing that happened to Iron Ridge, and now he was gone, and the ranch was still standing. That was the important part. Their daughter was born in the spring of the 2nd year, which surprised both of them in different ways. Mara had not entirely expected her body to still be willing, being 33, and Thorne had not expected, she thought, to be willing himself. To let something that new and that vulnerable into a life he'd spent years contracting around his losses. He was awkward with the baby at first, in the way of a man who understood that he could lose this too, and wasn't sure whether to hold on tight or keep his distance, and she told him plainly that he had to choose. And he couldn't choose distance because the baby needed her father present, whatever the risk. He chose present. He was, she thought, the most careful man she'd ever watched choose to be careful in the right direction. They named her Clara, which she offered, and he accepted with a silence that was full rather than empty. A son came 3 years after, whom they named James, after Mara's own father, a man she had described to Thorne on a winter evening over a year earlier, and who he'd never met but felt, she thought, like he knew something about. The children grew up knowing what their father was and what their mother had done, and approximately how the ranch had come to be what it was. Not as a legend, they were practical people and practical parents, and legends weren't useful, but as a fact. Thorne told them, when they were old enough to understand it, that he'd spent years hiding from his own life because grief was easier to carry when you made yourself small. He said it without a lot of decoration on it, because he'd never been a man for decoration. He said the lesson wasn't that grief was wrong or that hiding was unforgivable. It was that hiding was a thing you did for a while and then had to stop, and that stopping was its own kind of work. Clara listened to this with the focused attention she'd had since she was 2 years old and asked, "Who made you stop?" Thorne looked at Mara across the dinner table. "Someone who kept setting aside a warm meal for me," he said. "When nobody else noticed, I came last." Clara considered this. "That doesn't sound like stopping," she said. "That sounds like being noticed." "It is," he said. "That's the whole thing, really." There was a morning, many years on, when the children were half grown and the ranch had found its shape and the main house had long since stopped smelling like anything except living. When Mara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard and thought about the woman who'd arrived here with a cast-iron skillet and a carpet bag held together with rawhide. She didn't think about her with pity. You couldn't pity someone who'd made it, which was a simple and probably imperfect way to think about it, but it was honest. She thought about her with the particular recognition you have for a version of yourself that went through something and came out the other side changed in ways that couldn't all be named. She thought about what it meant to be the person nobody noticed. She'd spent a lot of her life in that position: the cook, the widow, the woman who arrived at the back door with good references and an empty pocket, the one people looked past when they were looking for the person in charge. She'd resented it sometimes, more than she'd admitted, even to herself. But she'd also learned something in it that she hadn't understood until Iron Ridge. Being overlooked gave you information. It gave you the freedom to watch clearly and record honestly and move through a space without anyone feeling the need to manage your perception. Holloway had underestimated her because she was the cook, and that underestimation had been the tool she'd used to survive him. Thorne had trusted her partly because she had no stake in the ranch's politics, no alliances already drawn. She'd come in clean and seen things as they were. Being invisible had costs. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but it also had uses, if you paid attention. She thought about Thorne taking the last seat, doing the hardest jobs, living in the margins of his own ranch for years because stepping back into his own life was more than he could manage, and nobody around him had the angle to see what they were actually looking at. She'd seen it because she'd been standing in the same place. 2 people at the far end of the table, eating what was left, asking for nothing, carrying things they hadn't put down. That was the thing about the people nobody noticed. They were usually carrying the most. They'd just gotten good at not letting it show, because showing it hadn't helped in the past. And when they finally put some of it down, when they finally let themselves be seen, it was usually because someone else had offered something small and genuine, a warm plate, a cup of coffee set aside. And that small thing had opened a door they'd thought was stuck forever. She'd heard it said, in the years since, that she was the one who'd saved Iron Ridge Ranch. Riverhawk had started it usually as a kind of introduction when strangers came through. This is Mara Callow. She's the one who kept the records that brought Holloway down. And she never corrected it because it was true as far as it went. But it felt incomplete. What she'd actually done was notice a man that everyone else had learned not to see, and treat him like he was worth noticing. And he'd done the same for her. And together they'd built something out of that mutual recognition that turned out to be stronger than what either of them could have held alone. That seemed like the real story to her. Not the records, though the records mattered. Not the skillet and the hot water, though she wasn't unhappy about the skillet and the hot water. But the specific act of one person looking at another person, a tired, overlooked, imperfect person eating alone at the far end of the table, and deciding they were worth the trouble of a warm meal. You couldn't know when you made that decision where it would lead. That was the thing. You made it without knowing. You kept a plate warm for someone who came last, and you didn't know that person was carrying a ranch on their shoulders, or that they were watching the same corruption you were watching, or that they would come for you when you were locked in a spring house. You didn't know any of that. You just knew that the person came last every night and ate alone, and that seemed like a thing worth changing. The world did not reward that kind of attention reliably. She knew that too. Sometimes you kept a plate warm for someone, and nothing happened except you were slightly kinder than you needed to be, which was its own form of worth but not a dramatic one. Sometimes the thing you noticed turned out to be nothing, and the record you kept turned out to matter to no one, and the courage you spent was spent on something that came to nothing. But sometimes it was Iron Ridge. Thorne came into the kitchen behind her. She heard his step before she heard anything else, which was still true after all these years, that she'd learned the specific sound of him the way you learned a house. And he came to stand beside her at the window. Outside, James was chasing one of the horses around the paddock in the inefficient way of a 9-year-old who thought enthusiasm could substitute for technique. Clara was watching from the fence rail, offering advice that was probably too technically sophisticated for a 9-year-old to implement, but accurate. Riverhawk was in the far paddock working a new horse, and his ease with the animal was visible even from a distance. "He's going to wear himself out before breakfast," Thorne said, meaning James. "He'll sleep well," she said. He stood beside her, and they watched their son try to corner a horse that had been evading 9-year-olds since before that particular 9-year-old was born. Clara called something from the fence. James ignored it. The horse moved with the specific condescension of a horse that has seen this before. "You're thinking," he said. He'd learned to read her silences the way she'd learned his. "I'm always thinking," she said. "What about?" She considered how to put it. "About how things start," she said. "The small things. How you can't see where they're going when you're in them." He was quiet a moment. "No," he said. "You can't." She looked at the yard, at the house that had been closed for 5 years and was now full of noise and burned toast and arguments about chores and a cat she hadn't planned on, and boots that were always in the wrong place. At the kitchen garden that Clara had started taking over with the focused competence she brought to everything. At a man who used to eat alone at the far end of the table, who was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, watching his son chase a horse in the morning light. She thought, this is what it looks like when something broken heals. Not clean, not perfect, lumpy and sideways and full of the normal difficulty of living. But real. Still standing, still here. The strongest person in the room was sometimes the one nobody noticed, until everything depended on them. She'd been that person. So had he. And the only reason either of them had found the other was because one of them, in a cold kitchen in October, had decided that the person who came last deserved a warm meal just as much as everyone else. That was it. That was the whole secret, if it was a secret. It wasn't grand, it wasn't complicated. It was just attention, paid freely, to someone the world had decided wasn't worth paying attention to. And look what grew from it. James finally cornered the horse, or the horse allowed itself to be cornered, which was a different thing that produced the same result, and let out a triumphant yell that Clara responded to with what sounded like measured skepticism. Mara smiled without meaning to, and felt Thorne's hand find hers at the window, and stood there in the morning light of her own kitchen, in her own house on a piece of Wyoming ground that had been through fire and come out the other side, and held on.